slid the folder across the kitchen table without looking at me. "Sign these, Mum. It's just paperwork." I looked at my son-in-law's hands. Thick gold ring. New watch. The kind of watch you buy when you've been spending someone else's money long enough to feel entitled to it. I didn't touch the folder. My daughter Renee stood near the counter, arms crossed, not quite looking at me either. She'd driven 3 hours from Mississauga for this. That alone told me how serious they thought it was. "What kind of paperwork?" I asked. "Just the transfer documents. For the house. We talked about this." We hadn't talked about this. Not once. Not in any conversation I could remember. And I remember quite well, despite what they'd apparently decided about me. I'm 73 years old. I live alone in the same house in Kitchener, Ontario, where I raised Renee and her brother, Corey. I worked 31 years as a dental hygienist. I paid off this house in 2009. I have a pension, a small TFSA, and more sense than either of my children currently credit me for. My name is June, and I had not agreed to sign anything. It started the previous autumn, about 8 months before that kitchen scene. That's when my son-in-law, Patrick, began calling more often. He and Renee had been having money troubles. I gathered this not because anyone told me directly, but because Renee stopped mentioning their vacations and the conversations shifted. They asked about the house more. How much did I think it was worth now? Had I considered downsizing? Was the upkeep getting to be too much? The upkeep was fine. I have a neighbor, Doug, who helps me with the heavier yard work in exchange for the rhubarb I grow along the back fence. My furnace was replaced in 2021. The roof has another decade in it, easy. But Patrick had done his research. He'd even printed out a real estate estimate, one of those automated online ones that can swing $50,000 in either direction, and left it on my coffee table after one visit, circled in red pen, like a sales pitch. Like I was a client he was warming up. I didn't say much. I made tea. I watched him. There's a kind of watching you learn when you spent 30 years putting your hands in people's mouths. You can't ask a lot of questions in that position. You read eyes. You read tension in shoulders. You learn to notice what people aren't saying. Patrick wasn't a bad man exactly. He was a frightened one. And frightened people make the worst decisions. Renee, I think, was going along with it the way she'd always gone along with things she was ashamed of. Quietly, without looking up. My other child, Corey, lives in Edmonton. He called me around Christmas that year, just to check in, and I mentioned offhandedly that Renee and Patrick had been asking about the house. There was a pause on the line. "How often?" he asked. "A few times." Patrick brought over some printouts. Another pause. Corey has always been the steadier one. He didn't panic. He just said, "Mum, you should probably talk to someone. A lawyer, just to know where you stand." I said I'd think about it. I did more than think about it. A woman I'd known since my working years, Bev. We used to eat lunch together in the break room every Tuesday for nearly a decade. Her sister had gone through something similar. Her brother had convinced her to add him to the title of her condo in Hamilton, just for convenience, he said. Just in case. And within 2 years, she'd had to fight to stay in her own home. Bev had told me that story over a club sandwich back in 2019, and it had stayed with me the way certain stories do. In February, I called a lawyer. Her name was Christine, and she worked out of a small office on Frederick Street. She had a no-nonsense manner that I appreciated. No soft music, no reassuring art prints. Just a desk, 2 chairs, and a legal pad. I told her everything. The visits. The printouts. The way Patrick had started referring to the house as the property, as if giving it a cold name might make me feel less attached to it. Christine listened without interrupting. Then she asked me a few quiet questions. Did I have a will? Yes, updated in 2018. Did I have a power of attorney for property and personal care? I had an old one, yes, naming Renee. She paused at that. Is Renee the one you'd still choose? She asked. I sat with that question longer than I expected. The honest answer was that the Renee I'd named in 2018 was a different woman than the one standing by my kitchen counter, not meeting my eyes. The Renee I named was the one who called me every Sunday, who drove up when I had my knee procedure, who knew, without being told, that I took my tea with a little too much milk. This Renee had stopped calling on Sundays. This Renee had a husband with a gold ring and printed real estate estimates. I'm not sure anymore, I said. Christine nodded like she'd heard this answer before. We spent 2 hours together that afternoon. When I left, I had a plan and a follow-up appointment and something I hadn't felt in months, a kind of quiet. Over the next several weeks, I made changes. Carefully and without telling anyone, I updated my will with Christine's guidance. I established a new power of attorney for property, naming Corey. I did the same for personal care. I reviewed my joint accounts. I only had one. A small checking account that Renee had been added to years ago for emergencies, and I restructured it. Nothing dramatic, just tidy. The house remained entirely in my name, as it always had been. I had never transferred anything, but I wanted to make sure the documentation was airtight, that every signature, every date, every notarized page said exactly what I intended it to say. Christine also advised me gently to keep a record of interactions. Not in a paranoid way, just notes, dates, what was said, who was present. I bought a small notebook, blue cover. I kept it in my nightstand drawer under a library book. I said nothing to Renee or Patrick. The folder appeared in April. They arrived on a Saturday afternoon, both of them, which was unusual. Patrick was dressed nicely, which was also unusual for a casual visit. Renee had brought a loaf of banana bread from a bakery in Mississauga, the kind I like. I noticed she'd thought to bring it. I noticed it the way you notice when someone remembers a detail right before asking for a favor. We had tea. We talked about the weather, about their neighbor's new deck, about a show Renee had been watching. Patrick laughed at the right moments. It all felt slightly rehearsed. Then Patrick went to his bag and brought out the folder. It's just a transfer of title, he said. Adds Renee to the deed. Lots of parents do it. Makes things simpler if anything ever happens to you. He said it so casually. If anything ever happens to you. As if age were a threat he was generously helping me prepare for. I looked at the documents. They were real documents, not something he'd printed at home. Someone had prepared these properly. That meant he'd already spoken to someone. That meant this had been in motion for a while. I looked at my daughter. She was looking at the banana bread. I'll need to have my lawyer look at these first, I said. Patrick's smile didn't disappear, but it changed. Tightened at the edges. It's pretty standard, June. Nothing tricky in there. He'd started calling me June sometime in the past year. I noticed that too. I used to be Mum. I'm sure it is, I said. I'll still have Christine take a look. Renee looked up then. Something crossed her face. I couldn't tell if it was guilt or relief. We finished the tea. They left before dinner. The banana bread was very good. I called Christine on Monday. I scanned the documents and emailed them to her. She called me back the same afternoon. She didn't mince words. Adding Renee, and by extension, as a married person, Patrick, to the title, would give them legal co-ownership of the property. In Ontario, this meant they could, under certain circumstances, force a sale. It also had implications for my estate, my capital gains, and my ability to make unilateral decisions about the house. This is not a simple administrative step, Christine said. This would be a significant and largely irreversible transfer of your most valuable asset. I already knew this, I think, but hearing it said plainly by someone with a legal pad in front of her made it settle differently. I did not sign the folder. The call started after that. Patrick, mostly. A few times a week. Each time with a slightly different angle. There was the practical angle. What if she needed to be hospitalized? Didn't she want things to be easier for everyone? There was the financial angle. Property values in Kitchener were at a peak right now. Didn't it make sense to think about this? There was the emotional angle, which was the one I found hardest. That came from Renee. She called one evening and she sounded genuinely upset, and she said that she just worried about me, that the house was too much for one person, that she didn't want me to be alone and struggling. I sat very still during that call. I'm not struggling, I said as quietly as I could. You could come live with us, she said. We have the space. They had a 3-bedroom semi-detached in Mississauga. What they actually had was a variable rate mortgage that was almost certainly the source of Patrick's new urgency. I didn't say that. I said I would think about it. I wrote the date and the content of the conversation in my blue notebook. Corey came to visit in May. I hadn't asked him to, but I told him more over the phone, and he'd booked a flight without making a production of it. That's Corey. He took me to lunch at a Greek place on King Street that I've liked for years, and I told him everything. The folder, the calls, the banana bread. He was quiet for a long moment. He ate a piece of pita bread. Do you want me to talk to her? He asked. No, I said. Not yet. Do you want me to come to the next conversation with them? I thought about it. Maybe. What do you want, Mum? Actually, nobody had asked me that in a while. The question surprised me enough that I had to set down my fork. What I wanted was to stay in my house, the house where I'd hung the same curtains in the front window for 20 years, where the back porch caught the evening sun just right in the summer, where I knew every creak in the 3rd stair from the bottom. I wanted to live there on my own terms, for as long as I was well enough to do so. I wanted to make my own decisions. I wanted my daughter back, the one who called on Sundays. But mostly, at that moment, I wanted people to stop treating me like a problem to be managed. I want them to ask, I said, not assume. Corey nodded slowly. The meeting happened in June. Renee and Patrick drove up, and this time Corey was there too. We sat around my kitchen table, the same table where Patrick had pushed the folder toward me 2 months earlier. Patrick hadn't known Corey would be there. His expression, when Corey opened the door, was something I filed away carefully. We were all civil. There was coffee. I'd made nothing special this time. Patrick made his case again. He talked about responsibility, about family, about making sure I was taken care of. He talked about the house as though he already knew its dimensions better than I did. And then Corey said, quietly, Mum's already made arrangements. Patrick frowned. What arrangements? I reached into the folder I'd set beside my chair. Not their folder, mine. I took out the documents Christine had prepared. The updated will, naming both children equally. The power of attorney for property, naming Corey. The letter from Christine confirming my full legal capacity and my clear, uncoerced wishes regarding the property. And the last page, which I'd asked Christine to include, a plain language summary of my legal rights as a sole homeowner in Ontario and what could and could not be done with my property without my explicit written consent. I set them on the table. I've spoken with my lawyer, I said. Everything is in order. The house is mine. It will remain mine. And when I choose to do something with it, I will make that decision myself. The kitchen was very quiet. Patrick looked at the documents the way someone looks at a door they thought was unlocked. Renee was looking at me, really looking at me, for the first time in a long time. I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. Patrick and Renee drove back to Mississauga that afternoon. Corey stayed for dinner. We made pasta with the jar sauce I keep in the pantry, and we watched an old film neither of us could fully remember. And I let myself sit on the couch without thinking about folders or phone calls or transfer documents. It was a good evening. Renee called 3 weeks later, on a Sunday, which she hadn't done in over a year. She called at 10 in the morning, which is exactly when she used to call before. She didn't apologize directly. Renee isn't built for direct apology. I know this about her. The way you know things about someone you've watched grow up. But she talked. She told me that things with Patrick had been hard, that there had been pressures she hadn't known how to talk about, that she'd convinced herself she was looking out for me, and that somewhere along the way she'd stopped asking what I actually needed. I listened. She asked if I wanted her to come up for a weekend, not with Patrick, just her. Yes, I said. Bring nothing, just come. She laughed a little. It was the first real laugh I'd heard from her in months. She came up on a Friday in July. We walked along the trail by the river, The one we used to do when she was a teenager and needed somewhere to put her thoughts. The trees were full. It was warm the way Ontario summers can be, not punishing, just generous. She took my arm at one point without saying anything. We didn't talk about the folder. We talked about other things. A book she'd been reading. A garden she wanted to plant. A memory she had of us making apple crisp one autumn when the power went out and we used the gas burner and ate it warm right out of the pan. I had forgotten that afternoon. She hadn't. There are things about being a mother that you carry without knowing you're carrying them, and every so often a grown child hands one back to you and you realize how long you'd been missing it. We sat on a bench near the water for a while. Neither of us spoke. The river moved the way rivers do, constant and unbothered and entirely its own. I'm still in my house. The curtains are still in the front window. The back porch still catches the evening sun. I have a new notebook, red cover this time, because I didn't need the blue one anymore. The red one is for other things. Recipes I want to try, books. Corey recommends. Small notes to myself about nothing in particular. Christine retired earlier this year and I sent her a card. She wrote back one line. You knew what you wanted? That's rarer than you'd think. I keep it tucked inside the red notebook. My daughter calls on Sundays. This past week she mentioned the apple crisp. Said she wanted to make it together in the fall when the Cortlands come in at the market. I said I'd be here. I will be. I think about the blue notebook sometimes, the one I kept in my nightstand drawer under the library book, where nobody would think to look. I filled maybe a third of it. Dates, conversations, the exact words Patrick used each time he called. Nothing dramatic, just a quiet record of what was happening. Written in my own hand, in my own house. That notebook was the most useful thing I did, not because I ever needed it in court or had to produce it as evidence, but because writing it down meant I couldn't talk myself out of what I was seeing. There's a way that pressure works on you, especially when it comes from people you love. It's gradual. Each conversation sounds reasonable on its own. It's only when you line them up, the printouts left on the coffee table, the calls about hospitalization, the banana bread brought a softening, that the shape of it becomes clear. I wasn't a suspicious person by nature. I raised my children to be honest and I trusted them longer than the evidence warranted. That's not a regret. I think it's actually something worth holding on to. The instinct to believe the best of the people closest to you. But there's a difference between trust and willful blindness. And somewhere in those months, I had to learn where that line was. What helped me most was asking myself a simple question. Whose interests are being served here? Not in a cold way. Just honestly. When Patrick explained why I should sign, who benefited? When Renee talked about my struggles, was she describing my life or her fears? The answers, when I let myself hear them, were clear enough. Christine told me I knew what I wanted. She was right, but I'd needed someone to ask. That's the thing about getting older that nobody prepares you for. Not the physical part, but the way people stop asking what you want and start telling you what you need. June needs to downsize. June needs to think about the future. June needs to be practical. Nobody asked June what June thought. I had to go find my own answers. I had to make the call, drive to the office on Frederick Street, sit in the chair, and say out loud that I wasn't sure I trusted the person I'd trusted most. That was the hardest part. Not the documents, not the table confrontation. Saying that first true thing to someone who had no stake in telling me I was wrong. Corey asked me what I actually wanted, and I had to set down my fork before I could answer. That pause, that small, embarrassing pause where I had to search for my own wish, is what I keep coming back to. We should know what we want without having to search for it. But life gets layered over, and sometimes you have to clear a little space before you can hear yourself again. I cleared the space. I made the calls. I sat at my own table and laid down my own folder, and that was enough. Renee came back. She took my arm on the trail. She remembered the apple crisp. Some things, once you stop letting them be taken, come back on their own.